Greetings, everyone. We apologize for the delay. Thank you for being here and listening to our notifications on the elections of 25th of April 2021. Just like we were informed yesterday during the 4 press conferences, we have provided details on the voting process. And during the pre-elections period, we have published 2 intermediate monitoring reports. Today, we are holding this press conference to share with you the statement on preliminary findings and conclusions coming as a result of the whole monitoring process starting from 6 September 2020, when the President of the Republic of Albania declared the day of the elections, until now, regarding the so far progress of ballot counting in Albania. It must be emphasized that in addition to the findings regarding the progress of the election process, in this conference and during our observation, we particularly focused on generalizing findings of observers in 360 polling stations across Albania who statistically observed the elections. Without further ado, I would like to share with you the preliminary conclusions of the process and handing over the floor to Ms. Antuela Male. Parliamentary elections of 25th of April were held in a polarized and conflictual situation that characterized the whole electoral campaign. Vote buying, intimidation of voters, and election crimes were the hot topic during the elections. This polarization escalated to physical violence and conflict, as well as loss of one life 4 days before the election day. It is very positive that this political rhetoric of the electoral campaign was not reflected on the election day. 25th of April elections were held in an amendment legal framework with different reflections on the electoral code, which violated the principles of public consultation and transparency, as well as the trust among the parties entered into the 5 June agreement. CRIC deems the whole process of fulfilling the legal framework as very positive because it guarantees high standard and high quality electoral process as long as the process is constructive and it enforces the law. The electoral administration process was quite efficient. However, there were issues that did not violate the process. It is deemed that the technical aspects administration by the CEC was mostly efficient and with higher transparency. However, CRIC notices that the 3 steering bodies of the CEC reflected a behavior that is not a behavior of one sole institution, but 3 bodies that are separate. The redimensioned institution of the CEC showed responsibility, transparency in organization, functioning, decision-making, and a positive cooperative approach with political actors, civil society, and the media. The Regulatory Commission decision-making is evaluated positively for its unanimous and consensual decisions among the whole parties, although in several cases discussions have been identified to have a biased political approach. This fact led to the resignation to the waiver of the ballot paper content. CAS decision-making is quite narrow and it does not play the role of an institution that is part of the CEC with the competence to impose sanctions in cases of violations. Its decision-making has diminished the idea to prevent any violations. This behavior was politically impacted, which was clearly noticed in attitudes of members of the commissions regarding cases when political parties had publicly biased attitudes. We positively appreciate the efforts of the CEC to use technology in 2021 elections, such as the electronic identification of voters in the whole country, camera monitoring of all polling stations, as well as the pilot project of electronic voting and counting, despite different anomalies that were noticed during the election day. As regards electoral areas, the activity of 92 zonal commissions of 92 commissions of electoral administration zones have been positive despite lack of infrastructure or necessary materials to carry out their work. The voters list process was not as transparent as required, and voters' written notification was not at high standards and led to different problems, such as the publication of the voters' lists and citizens' information. Regarding the right of the Albanian citizens who reside outside the territory of the Republic of Albania and failed, which is a lost opportunity and violation of political engagements between parties according to the agreement of 5th of June 2020. The collection of support signatures was a barrier for independent candidates. Of 8 initial commissions registered at the CEC, only 5 candidates managed to collect the necessary signatures to become part of the electoral race in 25th of April, and 3 of them used sources of organizational structures that already existed. The legal framework stipulates that the electoral campaign starts 30 days before the election day, and political parties are obliged to respect the rules stipulated in the electoral code. However, this did not prevent electoral subjects to start the campaign months before the official deadline. The vacuum created by the law in failing to define the electoral campaign leaves room for electoral subjects to start their de facto campaign with its own characteristics before the official date. The two main parties started their official campaign on 25th of March, which violated the provisions of the legal code and the orders of the Minister of Health to forbid gatherings of over 10 people. Even though the 25th of April elections would be carried out under the pandemic, the political parties did not discuss about it on the political council. The Albanian government failed to guarantee all citizens the right to vote. That is an undeniable and unviolated right in international conventions ratified by the Albanian government and the Constitution of the Republic of Albania. Public health institutions were slow and passive in addressing rules to be followed regarding the content of elections during the pandemic. Such legal regulation was conducted only for 24 hours before the voting date. Prohibition of citizens from North Macedonia and Greece to vote in Albania was a clear violation of the Electoral Court. Of concern is the change of the CEAZ members. There were some commissions of electoral administration zones that changed the majority of their members, which overlooked their training. Greek observers identified that in several commissions of electoral administration zones, commissioners were not well informed on their duties. Polling stations teams and vote counting teams were trained during a prolonged process due to delays of political parties in filing candidates for members of these commissions. Tough rhetoric, denigrating language to opponents, accusations and counter-accusations of buying votes characterized the campaign. This debate during the electoral campaign shifted attention from concrete platforms and plans that political parties were supposed to present. This rough rhetoric was also used by the President of the Republic, who openly opposed the Prime Minister of the country and the current government by considering it an electoral component. The state police did not take any disciplinary measure against parties in elections for violating the pandemic restriction measures. A different behavior was noticed against two independent candidates that were fined for failing to comply with COVID-19 restrictions. The establishment of the so-called structure to protect the vote by the Democratic Party is concerning because this unclear situation, which is not yet public, is considered as an unhealthy form of law enforcement, institutional behavior, and against rule of law. Violent political rhetoric used by political parties is considered very problematic. During electoral meetings carried out by political parties, we noticed an added presence of high officials of the public administration at the local and central level. This presence was identified during their official working hours, but after their official working hours too, wearing the relevant parties' logos reflecting their political affiliations. Of concern is also the participation of minors in electoral events, oftentimes accompanied by their family members, but other times wearing campaign and political party symbols. Financial monitoring of the electoral campaign by CEC monitors was almost inexistent during the electoral campaign. This has led to reduced transparency on a mechanism that was not efficient since its beginning. It may be concluded that the mechanism that aims at increasing transparency on the activities of electoral campaign failed to reach its primary function, that is transparency to the service of elections, which is problematic if we consider the fact that political parties are not obliged that during the electoral campaign to have financial self-reporting. Moreover, we identify Facebook pages that generated paid ads, even though they are not affiliated with any political party in a direct manner, that shows a campaign from third parties and expenditure hiding by political and electoral subjects. There we found sporadic cases when the media was mentioned as a power used by the politics, as well as accusations to journalists by politicians. The Audiovisual Media Authority did not define any deadlines on compensating time slots lost in the media. Failure to define this deadline for compensation within the official deadline of the end of the electoral campaign and not using the time for advertising different campaigns is a violation of the electoral code. Thank you, Antuela. These were some of the main findings of the monitoring process. The main findings of yesterday's election day and voting process, submission of materials at at ballot counting centers, as well as the main findings regarding the methodology, statistically based methodology, will be delivered by Mr. Taitan Taula. As you were informed during yesterday's press conference and intermediate reports, yesterday we had 360 observers on the ground stationed in 360 polling stations picked in a probability manner so that we could generalize statistics with an error margin of 5% and a confidence level of 15%. Regarding the voting process, what can be said is that the voting process yesterday was smooth and was well administered, with the exception of problems with voters' electronic identification in some polling stations. What is of concern is the illegal and inappropriate impact on voters in different polling stations that goes in line with different structures that were supposed to protect citizens' votes. The opening of the polling stations, there were delays beyond the legal time frame due to difficulties with activating electronic identification equipment. Only 6.3% of the polling stations started voting on time, and their other polling stations were delayed from several minutes to 2 hours. Almost half of the polling stations that were delayed, it was noted that there were voters waiting to vote at the moment when the polling station was opened. As soon as the polling station was opened, there were all commissioners in the majority of polling stations, and more specifically in 79.6% of them. The procedures of opening the polling station were correct from a procedural manner. The voting boxes, the ballot paper boxes were closed in a correct manner under the presence of all commissioners. Our observers in 66.3% of cases deemed that the opening of the polling stations were very good. Where there were problems, they did not deem that there were issues with the integrity of the process or any other purposeful issues. Now let us move on to the voting process. It was good. It was well administered from the procedural point of view. What is a problem is the added presence of individuals in the vicinity of polling stations. What was more, so the presence of these people was more problematic in several areas and less problematic in other areas too, but this might have prevented voters from giving their free vote and their free will. Unauthorized people were also problematic. They were present within polling stations. In 7% of polling stations, there were unauthorized people who were identified as representatives of an electoral subject or for a political force. On the other hand, there were people actively propagating in the vicinity of polling stations, that is less than 150 meters from the polling station. During the election day, 87.2% of polling stations worked with the full presence of all members of the commission. However, there were lacking in 12% of them. The majority of polling stations worked with the minimum quorum stipulated by the electoral code. During the day, the organization of polling stations was problematic. The premises of the polling stations in the morning were very good, but during the day, it was found that with the influx of voters, the ballot box and was easily to read. It was deemed that voting could be seen by observers and commissioners as well, due to a high number of people inside the premises. As regards the posters showing the names of candidates for political subjects, which is important because the ballot paper only contained numbers. Not all posters were displayed in all polling stations, which reduces chances of voters to elect the preferred candidate and party. In 6.5%, there were no posters with the names of candidates. As regards the voters list, in 7% of polling stations, there were no voters lists displayed. There was a low presence of women as commissioners in 72.6% of polling stations. The majority of commissioners were men, that is, at least 4 men or over. In 11.9% of polling stations, there were no women members of the commission. In 41% of polling stations, that were either 1 or 2 women members of the commission. From the procedural point of view, procedures in the majority of cases were punctually followed by the commissioners. There were minor procedural violations, such as failing to check voters' fingers, whether they had been marked or not previously. Some of the voters did not present any identification means, and so on and so forth. What is of concern as a procedural violation is allowing voters to use their smartphones inside the premises of the polling station, as well as allowing voters to use their cell phones while voting. And this is a huge issue. Using cell phones or other devices allows voters to take a picture of their vote, which is problematic. Commissioners' work was deemed very good in 72% of the polling stations and problematic in 3% of the polling stations. What is the problem is family voting. 24.2% of polling stations have had at least one case of family voting. Meanwhile, 2.4% of polling stations have had voters that either photographed or tried to photograph their ballot paper. And this is the issue with electronic devices used by voters. Of concern is also failure to know or to implement legal procedures for accompanying and assisting voters who actually need assistance, because this hampers the secrecy of votes. People who assisted voters have been allowed to do that without filling out a statement through which they declare that they haven't accompanied any other voter and that they will respect the will of the voter they are accompanying and will not share the vote. Of concern is also the fact that in 2.4% of polling stations, there were individuals that held more than one voter, which is forbidden, and in 2% of polling stations, it was noted that members of the commission were helping voters that needed assistance, which is not allowed. Failure of different electronic devices to function delayed the process, and it obliged the commissioners to move on to the traditional manual procedure of identification. In 96% of polling stations, there were problems with the functioning of electronic identification devices. Our observers noticed that in over 40% of polling stations, there was no access for persons with disabilities. Polling stations were either totally unadapted for people with disabilities or partially adapted. People suffering from vision impairments could access ballot papers in Braille alphabet, but 94% of these voters had to vote with assistance. They did not use a Braille ballot paper, and even the ones who did had to use both Braille alphabet and the assistance of another person. In a number of polling stations where the electronic devices failed to identify them, they had to sign on the vote list. This happened in 8.9% of polling stations. Another problem was the propaganda posters in a number of polling stations, generally in the form of voters who were present either outside or inside polling stations, wearing or displaying political party slogans and logos. Of concern for CRIC yesterday during the election day was hampering our observers in different forms to observe the process in open violation with the legal framework. Such hampering was done by commissioners that did not allow observers to observe by failing to recognize observers' rights according to the Albanian legislation. In 2.7% of polling stations, observers were hampered and prevented from observing the elections. Now let us move on to the procedures of closing polling station. The closing was in line with the procedures, with small deviations in sporadic cases when the integrity was not violated. 81% of the polling stations were closed on time, and the rest were closed a few minutes later. Only 6 polling stations were closed from 7:30 to 8 p.m. In no case did we notice that there were voters arriving after 7 p.m. As regards the closing procedures and sealing the ballot papers were implemented with small deviations in the most polling stations. Our observers deemed that closing procedures were good in 75% of the polling stations. A major problem that is noticed in different elections, despite the calls of civil society organizations, including CRIC, was that our observers were not allowed to stay during the submission of electoral materials in ballot counting centers. However, observers managed to observe from afar, from outside these ballot counting centers. Political representation in ballot counting centers was respected at maximum. 98.8% of ballot counting centers were subject to correct procedures in line with the electoral code. Borrowed procedures for storing and administering regular boxes were implemented correctly. In conclusion, I would like to share some comments about the start of the counting process and the so far progress. The counting process started in the late hours of Sunday, and until 1 o'clock today, at least 13 electoral administration zones have been concluded. What is an issue is that despite the legal framework has foreseen that the counting should continue without any interruption, and that the teams will count several boxes and then be replaced by another team to continue with other boxes, we have found that the counting process has been interrupted by saying that both the ballot paper counters are tired, and this delays the final result. But Albanian citizens deserve to be informed as soon as possible on the final results. So legal procedures regarding this issue are not being implemented. There have been several cases where CRIC observers and other observers haven't been allowed to enter ballot counting centers even after the counting process has ended, and this shows a violation of the legal framework, which is problematic because in addition to the observers, the media was also prohibited to enter ballot counting centers. Meanwhile, we have noticed that independent members, observers in Dibra and Bulchiza have not been allowed to enter ballot counting centers. The last element, until 13 o'clock today, based on information provided by observers, is that 43.3% of the votes have been counted across the country. These were the main findings regarding the voting and the ballot counting. Thank you, Dritan, for your findings and remarks. As was mentioned by Dritan, it is very positive that the counting process is quick. And in this regard, it is very important that commissioners and the CC administration continue constantly dedicating themselves to the counting process despite the huge workload that they have had lately. This applies to electoral commission members who should serve to the citizens and implement the law in the appropriate manner. They should cooperate with the other team for counting ballots in order not to delay the process and for no one to be tired, and for Albanian citizens to be informed on the election results as soon as possible. Regarding findings in general, what we can say is that based on what was mentioned by my colleagues, these are preliminary conclusions, and we must see some other elements that from the observational methodology must be viewed in their entirety based on our observers' findings. The ballot counting process is crucial and critical, and the observation details, such as the ballot counting manner and form, different minutes held by commissioners, are all very important and will determine the final results. Should you have any questions regarding what we shared with you, please feel free to ask us. I can see that there are no questions by the participants, and I would like to share my concluding remarks. I would like to bring to your attention that political forces must behave in a correct manner and fulfill law requirements in order to allow commissioners of electoral administration to do their job as defined by law. We encourage political parties and all candidates to restrain themselves from declaring results or celebrating victory before the end results. This will lead to a smooth process, especially in ballot counting centers, where it is important to have as few people as possible in order for the public health measures to be respected. Above all, the whole goal is to have smooth ballot counting process and accurate results. In the evening, we will have a short press conference to share other details regarding the counting process up to that point. You will be informed through your emails or our social networks on today's next press conference. Thank you.